From JBS Studios in Greater New York, this is the JBS News Update with Teisha Bader.
I'm Teisha Bader with the JBS News Update for Thursday, August the 13th, 2020. We open with a historic declaration today. Israel and the United Arab Emirates agreed to a full normalization of relations in what is being called the Abraham Accord. President Trump addressed the press today with the announcement, along with U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman and others, telling reporters that this was a truly historic moment. A joint statement from the United States, Israel, and the UAE, which Trump released, includes that Israel will halt any annexation efforts of parts of the West Bank. It reads, as a result of this diplomatic breakthrough and at the request of President Trump, with the support of the United Arab Emirates, Israel will suspend declaring sovereignty over areas outlined in the president's vision for peace and focus its efforts now on expanding ties with other countries in the Arab and Muslim world. The United States, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates are confident that additional diplomatic breakthroughs with other nations are possible and will work together to achieve this goal. Trump said he had spoken over the phone, finalizing the agreement with UAE Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed and with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Bin Zayed tweeted that an agreement was reached to stop further Israeli annexation of Palestinian territories and that the UAE and Israel also agreed to cooperation and setting a roadmap towards establishing a bilateral relationship. The UAE's foreign minister tweeted that the UAE is employing its decision for normal relations with Israel, writing it was doing so with courageous initiative to preserve the chances of a two-state solution, and that the nation calls for the resumption of negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis and is committed to working with friends to establish security and ensure the stability of the region. Netanyahu called the agreement historic as well and addressed the Israeli public about it this evening, praising the groundbreaking peace agreement. Regarding extending sovereignty, the prime minister said that the issue was still on the table and that nothing had changed, stressing that implementation of any such plan had to be done in full cooperation with the United States and that this suspension was temporary. Netanyahu further said of the accord that there will be an exchange of embassies, ambassadors, economic exchanges, direct flights between the UAE and Israel, among other things. He said this deal shows the huge change in how Israel is seen in the Middle East, and that more Arab countries, he believed, would now establish ties with Israel as well. Jewish organizations lauded the news today. B'nai B'rith International's leaders Charles Kaufman and Daniel Mariashin said these accords will now join the peace agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan as stabilizing influences in the region and send a strong message to those who seek to promote chaos that their efforts will not succeed. The American Jewish Committee tweeted, having engaged with states in the Arabian Gulf and throughout the Arab world for decades, we hope this opens the door to further agreements between Israel and her Arab neighbors. The leaders of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, Arthur Stark, William Daroff, and Malcolm Hoenlein, called the agreement the most significant diplomatic development in the Middle East since the 1994 peace agreement between Israel and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. They wrote, in taking this historic step, the UAE is paving the way for additional Arab and Muslim states to normalize their ties with Israel, which can help transform the region and enhance the prospects for a true and lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinians. This agreement, they said, is a bulwark against the forces of extremism and radicalism in the region. Turning to some other news now, police in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania are investigating vandalism at a local synagogue. ABC 27 reports that swastikas were found painted on the entrance of the Kesher Yisrael synagogue in the capital city Monday morning. Pennsylvania State Representative Patty Kim tweeted that while this may be an isolated incident, we cannot allow this behavior to become routine. She wrote, "Everyone has a role to play in combating bigotry." The American Jewish Committee called the incident abhorrent, writing that they stand in solidarity with the congregation and with the entire Jewish community of Harrisburg, stressing that the perpetrator must be brought to swift justice. Israel and the United States completed a test of the advanced Arrow 2 air defense system last night. The system was tested by Israel's Defense Ministry's Missile Defense Organization, the Israeli Air Force, the Israel Aerospace Industries, together with the U.S. Missile Defense Agency at the Palmachim Air Base in central Israel, where it successfully intercepted a simulated long-range missile over the Mediterranean Sea. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz praised the success, saying, "We will defend Israeli skies from any threat." Well, some hope for coronavirus patients. 3 patients treated with a so-called passive vaccine for the coronavirus were released from the hospital today in Israel. The Times of Israel reports that the patients had been in moderate condition, suffering from pneumonia caused by COVID-19. The treatment they received was derived from plasma donations of recovered COVID patients, collected by the blood bank at Hadassah Medical Center and by Magen David Adom, and then delivered to Israeli biopharmaceutical company Kamada, who produced what it calls anti-SARS-CoV-2 plasma-derived immunoglobulin product. Hadassah said today that the patients demonstrated rapid clinical benefit from the experimental treatment. Hadassah Director Ze'ev Rothstein told the news outlet that he was cautiously optimistic. He said, "I don't know if it's beginner's luck, but we are very enthusiastic. For a physician to see such an improvement in a very short period of time is astonishing." Taking a look now at our programming for tonight on JBS for Thursday, August the 13th. At 7 o'clock, it's Talmud study. At 8, a discussion on the influences of the Pharisees on Jesus, Christianity, and anti-Semitism. At 9, Mark Golub sits down with Charles Small on L'chaim. At 10:30, Carolyn Glick discusses the BDS movement. And coming up next, it's the ILTV's Insider. And that's the JBS News Update for Thursday, August the 13th, 2020. I'm Teisha Bader. Stay healthy. Stay well.